As soon as its branch becomes tender, through about 1800 years, God had dispersed Israel into all the nations. And they had become a blessing to the nations as God promised Abraham. But they didn't have a nation of their own. That it was the desire of Israel to return and to go back to Jerusalem and to reestablish the worship in Jerusalem and to become their own nation again where they could worship God in accordance with the law. So this was a desire that they had, but had not been able to fulfill it until the 1800s. In the 1800s, the Balfour Declaration and the Jews were able to come back, and there was a period of time when the Jews returned from the world, from around the world, and they settled in Jerusalem after World War I, and the Jews worked to get their own nation. Then in 1948, Ben Gurion declared that Israel was a free and independent state according to the mandates of the UN that had given them permission to establish their own state. And they began the nation of Israel again in 1948. The fig tree budded. The fig tree started to put out leaves. And Jesus said, when you see that happen, you know that He is near, even at the door. He goes on to say, truly I say unto you, this generation. So what's the context of this? Well, the generation when the fig tree budded. This generation will not pass away till all of these things take place. So Jesus said when the fig tree buds, that His coming is near, even at the gate or at the door, and that the people living alive when the fig tree buds, that there would be some, at least two, who would live until the end of the age when Jesus came. Or at least one, because if you pare down what He is saying here, He said this generation will not pass away. So as long as there's at least one person that was alive in 1948, that's alive at the end of the world, that prophecy is fulfilled. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Okay, so if Jesus is talking about the generation at the end of the world in verse 34, then we don't have to take everything before that in the context of the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's what has been the common approach to this chapter, is take all these things and before verse 34 as referring to the destruction of Jerusalem, when the language sounds much more apocalyptic than that. The power in verse 29, for example, which is before verse 34. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven. The powers of the heaven will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with great power and glory. Well, that sounds like the second coming of Christ, doesn't it? But because it was before verse 34, that language has been applied to the destruction of Jerusalem. And they say Jesus came in judgment at the destruction of Jerusalem. And then they say that the sun being darkened and the moon not giving her light was symbolic language referring to the lights being turned out in Jerusalem and Israel. And actually, that's a terrible exegesis because there's no basis for it. But that's what has been done in order to try to render this a discussion of the destruction of Jerusalem. Some people have placed the transition where he began answering what will be the sign of thy coming in the end of the age. In verse 23, then if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christ will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray if possible the elect. Josephus, the great Roman historian, wrote a history of the wars of the Jews. And in it, he talked about the destruction of Jerusalem. And he talked about the false prophets. And in fact, the Bible even mentions when Paul was arrested, the captain of the guard asked Paul, "Are you not that Egyptian that went out into the wilderness and led people after you, about 4,000 people?" And Paul said, "No, but that was one of the false prophets that had led Israel astray before the destruction of Jerusalem." And there were some. Josephus mentions others who were false prophets. But notice what Jesus said regarding the false prophets that he would teach. You know, AD 70 was not the only time in history when there have been false prophets. And Jesus said the false prophets of which he referred, he said in verse 24, "For false Christ and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the very